Hello and welcome to the New Voice of Ukraine series of questions and answer interviews that we have with either our own staff or with guest expert, as is the case this week. These happen twice a month, and they are connected to our Patreon. So patreon.com/NVUA. You can go there for a host of premium content, including the ability to ask these questions, as well as infographics, newsletters, and a bunch of different additional bits of information you get from subscribing and being a premium member. So this week we are joined by Vera Serova. She is a volunteer lawyer with NovaUkraine, a California-based NGO that aids Ukraine in a bunch of different ways. But this week we're talking to her specifically about the issue of Ukrainian refugees in America, the services that they are currently entitled to, and what could unfortunately be some changes in policy in the United States that could take those services and rights away from them. So, Vera, thank you very much for joining us. Hope everything's going okay over there in California.
Hi, Anthony. Very glad to be here today. Yes, today is actually a rainy day here in Los Angeles, but generally it's almost always sunny in California and everything's going well.
Wonderful. So, just to start us out, can you just give a brief rundown of what NovaUkraine does? I suggest everyone goes to their website at NovaUkraine.org to get involved in the various projects they have. But can you just give us the elevator pitch for what NovaUkraine does?
Sure. NovaUkraine is, as you said, an NGO which was organized by Ukrainian expats who work here, primarily in California, in Silicon Valley. It was organized back, before the current iteration of the war. My recollection is after 2014, and it's been raising money to help Ukraine, to help Ukraine fight for independence and to help refugees who are trying to, escape from Ukraine, and also people who remain in Ukraine and who are in difficult conditions, whether it be, humanitarian problems that they have, such as, some regions have no light or have insufficient medical supplies. So NovaUkraine sends money and sends also specific items that are needed there and helps Ukraine in various ways. It has volunteers there in Ukraine who work closely with it. And so it helps primarily Ukraine in that way. But also it has here in America what we call as a refugee team. It's a team of people who helps Ukrainians who have come to America and who are resettling here and, trying to learn the language, get housing, get jobs. Our team here is heavily focused on help with housing because that's one of the most challenging things for people coming is to find secure housing. So our refugee team works with a network of hosts who offer free housing to people. And so that's what our team does, is helps families find housing. But also they have other types of help. I know they have psychological support help. They have, I think now, some ESL options like English. English is a second language, basically options to help people learn English. They sometimes arrange for like car donations and other essential item donations. So basically try to support refugees in various ways. And I personally am more on the legal side and immigration side. So I provide advice on how to apply for protections, how to acquire legal status in the U.S., and how to deal with immigration service, which is not always, easy to deal with. And there are various issues and hiccups. And so I support people from that side.
And you're a volunteer, correct? Most of the
Yes, I'm a volunteer with NovaUkraine. I have a full-time job elsewhere.
So on the issue of Ukrainian refugees, you said it started out in 2014 or so. But with this main part of the war, I'd imagine that most of the refugees would have been in like the early months of the war. Is that the case? Has the inflow of refugees been pretty much steady, or does it go in like big chunks?
So the whole refugee, let's say, direction of NovaUkraine's work is started in 2022. Before that, it was mainly aid to Ukraine. Yeah. So what happened in 2022 when the war began, and obviously, there was a lot of people fled Ukraine to different countries, and a portion of the people came to US border, mostly southern border, through Mexico to try to get into the United States. At first, those people were mostly those who had family members in the United States. So they were seeking where they can, where they have somebody who has, who can house them, who can give them shelter. Because at that time, everybody thought that the war would end soon, that is just a few months thing. So people were looking, where do we have relatives in what countries where we can basically wait out this short period of time. And those people who had somebody in the US, they started like flowing to US borders and trying to get into the country. Now, normally, if you don't have a visa, you cannot get into the United States. But because there were so many people accumulated at the southern border, the United States government started letting them in on what is called humanitarian parole, which is basically a way for the American government to let somebody in when they don't have a visa, but they have an urgent humanitarian reason to be in this country. And for those people, this reason was that there was the war in their country and they had someone here in the US who could take care of them during that period. So for a short period, I would say from late March to late April of 2022, for about a month, a lot of Ukrainians came through Mexican border through this process. At first, it was very chaotic, and that's when NovaUkraine stepped in. We were going to Mexico. They were mostly coming through Tijuana, which is a city that borders American border, and
Right.
on the other side of the border is San Diego. So this is one of the main entry points for immigrants in general who come through the land borders. And so there were a lot of Ukrainians waiting in Tijuana because they couldn't be processed fast enough. So they were sheltered there, and the Tijuana government allocated a gym, like a big building, to give them shelter, and they were basically sleeping there like on a mats. And we with NovaUkraine went there in shifts to help those people, basically just provide them, food, provide them, make sure they're safe there because Tijuana is a pretty dangerous place, make sure they have transportation to the border. And so by the end of April, we had a, well-organized system where everybody had a number and people were called according to the numbers, and there were buses that were taking them to the border to be processed and led into the United States. Now, and at the same time, I would say in April, we started thinking about how do we provide essential information to these refugees, because people were coming into the United States. They didn't understand how can they get any help, what help is available, like are there any like food assistance, cash assistance to refugees, how to get health insurance, do they need work permit to work, if yes, how do they get it? So they didn't understand where to go, how to get those essential documents, because unlike Europe, where there were so many people, that Europe very quickly organized some processes.
Their whole processing, like encampments, basically.
So in the United States, it was very chaotic because there were relatively few people here. So it was all ad hoc, and like nobody was knowing what to do, including, the government, the social services. They had no idea like what these people are entitled to, and so on. So we decided to create this website where we would put basically essential information for refugees, where to go, how to get essential services. And so that's how NovaUkraine's refugee portal was born. And at first, when people were coming through Mexico, we were giving them like leaflets with information with a barcode, which led to this portal so that they could go there and find all the, first steps basically that they need to take once they're in the US. Now, then in late April.
One question, because this is interesting to me. So were the Ukrainians mixed in with the other refugees and migrants coming in from the southern border, or did they have a separate line, basically?
I think they had a separate line pretty much, because they were given numbers and they were processed in the order of these numbers. And I think at that time, of course, on the southern border, there's always like a lot of Latin America immigrants. But I think at that time, and it was just after COVID as well, so the border was just reopening after COVID. I think at that time there were a lot more Ukrainians than everybody else for that period of time. And I think they were given a special treatment. There was a separate line for them. The border control received separate instructions how to deal with them so that they could be processed fairly quickly. everybody understood that they're not asylum seekers, as usually people are who come to the southern border. So they had kind of a separate process for them where they were just giving this humanitarian parole.
So were other organizations that usually deal with refugees coming in from the southern border, were they also dealing with Ukrainians, or was that kind of
Yes.
treated as a separate issue?
Yes, first of all, we had a few churches from Sacramento. Sacramento in California has a large Ukrainian community, and we had several churches who helped a lot there. And a lot of Ukrainians who actually came through those during that first month, they settled in Sacramento because they got help from Sacramento from the start. So they went there and they resettled there. There were also some organizations who work at the southern border, San Diego organizations who normally help asylum seekers. They mostly work with Latin Americans, but at that time they also stepped in and started helping Ukrainians, including giving them temporary shelters like hotel vouchers, some immigration issues if there were still some cases, where there was some misunderstanding or people were giving, notice to appear in court for some reason because the border control didn't understand that they were from Ukraine. So there were various issues. And so those organizations also stepped in to help with that as well.
Yeah, I'd imagine that a lot of these organizations have a lot of experience with like Spanish speakers, but was there much were there Ukrainian language translators on hand at like some random Catholic church in San Diego?
They recruited volunteers. And I think even some of our people collaborated with them. So they basically said, yes, we have these services. Sometimes they just said, you have to come with your own translator. And it were our volunteers who basically handheld these Ukrainians. And there was a whole process organized at the border where people would come in and our volunteers would meet them and ask, do you guys have a place to stay? If they said no, then we would take them to one of these organizations, say, hey, we have this family, they have nowhere to stay. Can you give them like a shelter for how many days do you guys need? They would say maybe like we need 2 days and we'll have flight elsewhere in the United States to our family. So we would organize this housing for them and then make sure they get to the airport and on the way to wherever they have relatives and where they're going to stay. So some people, like, we help rent them hotel rooms. Some people, we place them with hosts who were willing to get the families in for free. So we basically handheld them through these first steps to make sure that they can communicate and get housed.
And were you mostly involved in this process in California, or do you have branches elsewhere in the United States, Chicago?
NovaUkraine is based in California. A lot of the work we do remotely. So actually, we are kind of unique in that sense because a lot of these resettlement organizations that are government funded are very location based. So they only serve people in their city or their county. We actually work with people all over the United States. And our refugee team has a network of hosts all over the United States. I know they, had some places in like Kansas, for example, where there were people willing to host refugees for free for some time. And so if somebody had nowhere to stay and no money to rent the room, they would sometimes just send people there, and so that they could stay there for a few months, earn some money, and then decide where they want to go and when they're able to rent housing on their own. Yeah, we are basically nationwide, although physically the organization is based in California.
So I hadn't actually prepared for this question. You brought up the issue of funding, and right now we've had multiple interviews where we talked with different organizations, and of course the big issue right now is end of federal funding for a lot of issues. In Ukraine, it was USAID, but also in the United States, a lot of federal programs are closing down. So was NovaUkraine affected by that at all?
No, NovaUkraine doesn't work off of government grants, at least as far as I know. I'm not a part of the funding team, so I don't have close knowledge of that, but mostly we work on donations. So it's just, individual donors or organizational donors, but it's not federal funding, which means we're not constrained by any of the federal rules. We don't have to report how this money is allocated and spent. We're not, again, constrained by any locality, because if it's government funding, it's oftentimes allocated to specific community and you cannot get beyond the geographical borders of that community. So we don't work like that. And yeah, a lot of, like, after Trump became president, he cut federal funding severely, especially for refugee programs. And a lot of the organizations that we partnered with and worked with and collaborated with either downsized and sent their personnel on leave, without pay, or they just were defunded so that we lost some of the community part. Like we work with Catholic charities to sometimes, because they had housing resources. So sometimes if we couldn't place a person, we refer the person to them and they would place it within their network. They also did a lot of help with like immigration documents also, and with like helping persons apply for benefits. And now they just don't have people to do that anymore and don't have the resources to do that. So now it's all on us to help people do that. And we try to, they used to do it basically for people. So resettlement agencies, which are government funded organizations to help refugees, including Ukrainians, you could come there and say, I'm from Ukraine, here's my Ukrainian passport, and they would do everything for you. They would apply for your health insurance, they would apply for your work authorization, they would provide you with food assistance, they would enroll you in programs that help you get employed, and into English classes. It basically was a full service process. But now, because they are defunded and they're not serving Ukrainians anymore, people don't have that network to rely on. And so they basically come to us and say, how do I do this? How do I do that? How do I apply for health insurance? How I do fill out this immigration form? And so we try to create some, guides or video tutorials that allow them to do it basically by watching the video, because we just also don't have the resources to do it for everyone, So we just try to make something that works for a lot of people and just give it to them. And so here's how you can do it yourself.
Yeah, I had to let out a sigh when you mentioned Catholic charities, because that was one of the ones specifically named by the Trump administration for them to kind of go after and attack. So
they did a lot. Yeah, they were a good one.
So to kind of rewind here to some of the legal issues surrounding being a refugee in the United States in general. So we'll kind of break this up into smaller categories of first any refugee and then Ukrainians specifically. But in general, what are the kind of legal protections that a refugee has when they enter the United States as an asylum seeker or just someone coming in on a plane from Warsaw or something? Like, what are the rights that you have as a refugee?
So the issue here, to spoil a little bit, is that Ukrainians are actually not refugees, unfortunately. They are given humanitarian parole, but they're not refugees. So if you're talking about the classic refugees, first of all, they have a right to get a green card after a year. So once they come in, a year later, they can apply for green card, and that's the path to the permanent residency, and then they can become an American citizen in 5 years. Also, just by the fact that they're refugees, they are awarded a lot of protections. First of all, they are automatically given work permits. They are entitled to all sorts of public benefits, such as free health insurance for the first year, and going forward, if they remain low income, food assistance, cash assistance, English language classes. Refugees are usually, there's a whole resettlement process where when they fly in, somebody meets them at the airport from a resettlement agency, like a Catholic charities, for example, meet them at the airport, takes them by the hand, and then again, it provides them full service process where they completely set with housing, with benefits, with English classes. They have cultural training, in work training where they're, being helped to get employed. And they also are protected from, for example, work discrimination by immigration status. So nobody can deny to hire them just because they're a refugee or from another country. So the law protects them. So Ukrainians, when the government, so we kind of didn't get to that, but after months that Ukrainians were coming through the Mexican border, the American government finally instituted this program called Uniting for Ukraine, so that the process can be, let's say, more civilized, right? Because the Mexican city where they were waiting to cross is very dangerous. There were all kinds of stories where people were kidnapped, exploited by cartels. So this was all not looking very well, in the media. And Europe had all this, refugee acceptance and resettlement programs, and America didn't have anything. So Biden created this program United for Ukraine so that America also has some kind of a program to accept these people so they can fly in safely, to the place where they need to be. They're processed. And as part of that program, the Congress allocated some money for also support of Ukrainians. And the law that did that said basically that Ukrainian parolees who come under this program are entitled to the same benefits as refugees. So they were kind of equated with refugees in terms of like what they're entitled to. But okay.
not actually refugees.
But then refugees.
Therefore, if that, we'll get to that later, but okay, I am seeing how this is starting to come together.
Yeah. So first of all, as soon as this law came out, people started saying, well, if we're entitled to the same benefits of refugees, then can we get a green card in a year? And the response was, no. We didn't mean that. It's temporary. It's only while there's war. It's a temporary status. You were here for 2 years, but you're entitled to like support services as refugees. But then there was a lot of confusion in social services and resettlement agencies as to who is actually entitled to the services and on what grounds. It took several months to just get the first Ukrainians to start getting the services, because especially at least resettlement agencies, at least they know what the services are, but it took some time for them to receive a memo that they can serve Ukrainians. So it didn't happen instantaneously. It took several months for them to understand that, okay, if a Ukrainian person comes to you, they have these letters on their admission document, then this person is entitled to X. Some of the services are provided through these resettlement agencies. Some of the services are provided through just the county social services agencies, which are just like every American who is low income can go to their county social services agency and get like food stamps or get free health insurance. So a lot of people went through these county agencies, and there was a complete confusion and misunderstanding, and nobody knew what this means and what this document that Ukrainians have and what they're entitled to. And we had everybody was denied, and we had to appeal, and we had to argue. And the social services were telling us, okay, yes, we see that there's a law, but we didn't receive instructions from our state agency yet. It has to go from the federal level to the state level, then to the county level, then to us. It all took indefinite amount of time. So it was a lot of just bureaucracy and hurdles, just because people didn't understand what it means that they're entitled to the same services as refugees, and while they actually had a different status. In some states like California, for example, New York, democratic states, the process went quicker and people were able eventually to get services. In some Republican states, and especially those where there are not many Ukrainians, people never were able to get free health insurance or some food assistance, cash assistance. Even though they were entitled to it, they just weren't able to get through the system and to prove that they're entitled to it. And, when you are a Ukrainian person who doesn't speak English, who doesn't understand how the system works, how this government works, when you are required to prove that you're entitled to something, it's very, very challenging. So that was part of a lot of what I was doing, especially in the first, year of war, is just educating these agencies, helping people appeal, helping people argue that they're entitled to these benefits, because finding state instructions, county instructions, which says, okay, Ukrainians who have UHP in their admission document are entitled to these benefits. But it was a struggle. It took us a lot of effort to make sure people, could get the assistance they needed.
Yeah. Bureaucracy is my biggest fear in life, and I'm currently going through my residency status in Ukraine, which is ultimately not that complicated. So hearing you describe all that kind of gave me heart palpitations. That sounds like an absolute nightmare to go through. But you did mention that a lot of this is very local, about what local services and local capacity. So is this a lot of an issue of rights? Like someone would have the same right to services in, Mississippi or Alabama as they would in California? Or is it more of a capacity thing where you have the rights to them, but they don't have the office funded to do it?
For a long time, it was more of a knowledge problem. As you may know, the social services organizations, they don't pay that well, and they don't hire the smartest people. The social workers, they oftentimes, they're not lawyers, they're not and they had to work with, to their credit, with a lot of migrants. And Ukrainians are number 205 on the list. They have Cubans, they have Mexicans, they have the whole Latin America, who are much more numerous than Ukrainians. And there is a gazillion of different statuses, and some of them are legacy statuses, which people were given at various points of time. They don't exist anymore. And their instructions, who is entitled to what, are like a mile long. So when a Ukrainian person comes to a social service agency and talks to a social worker who's never before worked with a Ukrainian person, of course they wouldn't know what this person is entitled to. And they would look into this, they would work off some default scenario where and in many states, the default scenario is, unless you have a green card, you're not entitled to anything. And so they would just stamp denial on that basis, and then you would have to come back to them with, we'll have to find instructions. And they don't even use, you can't come to them with federal law, because they're not lawyers. They don't work by federal law. They work by county instructions. You have to find an instruction from this county to its own social services agency. You have to print it out for them, because they can't even find the instruction, because they get a gazillion of these instructions every day about all kinds of issues. So you have to find the right instructions for them, print it out, highlight the paragraph which says Ukrainians paroled during this time are entitled to ABC. You have to give this to the social worker along with the immigration documents of this person, and advocate that this person is entitled, because this is your instruction and it says here that they're entitled. And so then they will look at it and they say, okay, yeah, maybe. Sometimes it doesn't work even like that. They just don't understand, and you have to appeal, and then the administrative judge says they're entitled. So it's just a knowledge issue. And also the other issue that kind of overlaid on that was that the rules were changing all the time. So this law that said Ukrainians have rights to the same services as refugees, it was only for a year, because Congress allocates money by fiscal year. So for fiscal year 22 until September of 2023, they said, okay, people who come during this time period are entitled to the services because we've allocated the budget for it. Now, when that fiscal year ended, we couldn't get the budget passed for until April. I think the budget for the next fiscal year was passed only in April. It was a miracle that we avoided government shutdown. There was some temporary budgets passed in the interim, but none of them were, none of them included any refugee stuff. That it was just for Central American services. So when the final budget finally passed, it was in April of 2024. It again included aid for Ukrainians who came in the new fiscal year. But because of that gap between September and April, people kind of fell out of eligibility. So all the social services got new instructions rolled out from the federal government to the state, from the state to the county, from the county to the social services, which in October of 2023 said, okay, nobody's eligible anymore. Nobody's eligible. Stop giving them assistance. So now it took them 5 months to just learn that they do not have to give assistance. By that time, people were already again eligible for assistance. So there was complete confusion, because the social services were working by old instructions and not yet received the new instructions. It's just because it was changing every year. It was such a headache to go back and forth with the social workers, and there's a lag as to how quickly they get instructions, several months lag. So it was just a lot of educating people and a lot of struggle.
So it's possible to time out of the system while the system wasn't actually working?
Catching up, yeah. So there was that problem. And then ending last fiscal year, September 2024. So in the new budget, I think we're still working on a temporary budget. I don't know if they even passed I don't think they even passed the final budget yet. But again, so
it's they bunch of things are complicated, but yeah, something just happened that was able to kind of keep the budget going at least.
Yeah, but long story short, since September 30, again, nobody's eligible for anything, because again, there's no new budget for Ukrainian support. So again, nobody who came after that date is eligible for any services. And when nobody eligible on the federal level, then you fall down to the state level and you see what the state gives you from the state's own budget. So in California, for example, Ukrainians who came even at the beginning of this year, can still get free health insurance because California gives health insurance to everyone, even undocumented people. They can still get food stamps. They can still get cash assistance. So because it's a democratic state, you pretty much can get anything. But if you're like in Alabama, you won't get anything at all because they don't give anything out of state budget to immigrants. So now it's state by state. So I had to make these charts, if you're in this state, you can get this. If you're in that state, you can get that. And even if you can get it by the state laws, then again, there's a knowledge problem because now it's not from the federal money, but it's from the state money. But does the social worker actually know this? So it's again a whole layer of educating the social workers that yes, because now they say, well, we know that after September 30, nobody's eligible for anything, so deny it. And you have to educate them that yes, on a federal level, they're not eligible, but our state gives it to them. So you have to look into this instruction, and it says that on a state level, they're still eligible for X, Y, Z. So yeah, it's been challenging.
Yeah, just to editorialize here for a bit, a lot of people like to say refugees and immigrants have to do everything the right way. Well, the right way is, as you just described, a Kafka-esque labyrinth of bureaucracy and red tape that people can very easily get lost in and get devoured by the Minotaur. So horrifying you just described. But this is an interesting question because what makes it so that Ukrainians were not technically refugees? The word refugee is used pretty loosely. And sometimes it's used for Ukrainians who are just internally displaced even. It's like a very generalized, loose word in journalism and general parlance, but legally, it's a very specific thing. So what makes it so a Ukrainian is not a refugee?
Well, yeah, Americans are hostages of their own laws, which are sometimes pretty, outdated and long time due for an update. In terms of refugees, so by law, a refugee is somebody who has been personally prosecuted based on their race, religion, political opinion, belonging to some social group like LGBT, for example. So you have to, and the key here is personal prosecution. So it's the concept is similar to political asylum or to asylum, but asylum is received once you're already in the US, and refugee is somebody who needs to flee their country and they receive this refugee status by United Nations recommendation or through some other process, but they are given the status before they come to the country, and then they are paroled into the country as a refugee. So they come into the country already with this status. But because there's this limited grounds on which you can be considered a refugee and it requires personal prosecution, technically people who just flee the war are not refugees and they cannot be considered refugees by law. And America does not have any status which allows such people, to legally enter the country other than humanitarian parole, which is a mechanism which was used to let them in.
So say, for example, that Ukrainian is in occupied territory, they're a Protestant, they're a dedicated Ukrainian speaker, like some category that the Russians specifically target in the occupied territories, including Crimea, which had been illegally annexed a long time ago. That allowed them to be considered a refugee in the United States, or because that would, recognizing that territory as Russian to say that they're a refugee from, like, what is the technicality there? Like, would they be allowed to be a refugee if they're from occupied territory?
Possibly. I don't know that anybody came as a refugee like that, because even to become a refugee before you get to the United States is a process. I know that some people who came as parolees on Uniting for Ukraine applied for asylum in the United States, which basically requires the same showing that you were prosecuted for your political opinion or nationality and so on. And immigration attorneys differ in their opinion on whether such cases are viable. People from occupied territory who have strong, nationalist opinions and are or could be prosecuted for them definitely have a stronger case than somebody from, Western Ukraine. And a lot of people from occupied territories applied for asylum on that basis. How those cases play out, we don't know yet, mostly because asylum cases take years to get adjudication. So we'll have to see when, the the time comes for them to be adjudicated. But it also depends on what the situation will be in the country when those cases are adjudicated. Because, if it's years later and the war is over and Putin's dead and Ukraine's, freed, then those people would not have for asylum anymore because it's not an occupied territory anymore. If, God forbid, it remains an occupied territory and Russia settles there, for a long time, then and these people have strong opinions and they can prove that they voiced these opinions, then possibly they could get asylum. So it's very case by case, depending on how politically active the person is and where they are from and what the situation is in that city or town.
And they would probably have to pass through the EU or another country that raises the questions of, where you're first touching down in.
These rules, I think I'm not an asylum attorney, so I don't know the specifics, but I think these rules shifted somewhat. At some point, yes, there was a rule that if you were in some other country for any, not just a transit, but stay there for at least for a while, then you should have asked for asylum there. And if you didn't, then you are not eligible to ask for it here. I don't believe that's the rule now because a lot of people from both Russia and Ukraine cannot even get to the United States right now without passing through some other country because there are no flights, direct flights. So, and they still ask for asylum. So I don't believe that's the current rule. But again, I'm not an asylum attorney, so don't quote me.
Okay, got it. So the way you've described the Unite for Ukraine program is that it is in most ways identical to the normal refugee system, but other than the issue that you described of timing and special funding and all that, are there any other particularities that people should be aware of?
Well, there wasn't so much handholding as there is for refugees. So again, if you're a refugee, you basically met at the airport by the resettlement agency, and then they do everything for you. For Ukrainians, there wasn't this initial part where they were connected to some caseworker. So when they come to the country, they had to figure out on their own who to go to or where to go to. If they come to Catholic charities, they can get help there. But even to figure out that you can go to Catholic charities, it requires a certain level of knowledge, or you need to do some research, or somebody needs to tell you that. So over time, as we got more people coming in, the communities started to form in at least big cities, and people just learned these things by word of mouth, basically. But at the beginning, there was a lot of confusion, and people didn't know even where to go. So we also tried to connect them to different resettlement agencies and do a database, what resettlement agencies in which city are helping you. Right now, resettlement agencies are not helping Ukrainians at all anymore because there's no budget for it. So Ukrainians are on their own. In some states, they can still get some help. In the Republican states, they can get almost no help. And the most recent developments we had is that Trump paused all their benefit applications because they're now purportedly investigating these people and their sponsors and how they came to the US and whether they're entitled to anything at all. So we unfortunately have right now a lot of people who are out of their work authorizations, who are getting evicted from their houses because they lost their job, because they can't work anymore. People who are out of health insurance, because to get health insurance in the US, you need to have legal status. Generally, people who weren't even allowed, because if you come here on a humanitarian parole, if you want to fly outside of the United States, make a trip to Ukraine or elsewhere to see your family, you need to get a permit for that. Which is called advance parole. So if you fly out without the document, you won't be allowed back in. So we have people who have, close family members on a deathbed in Ukraine or in Europe, and who cannot get this advance parole to visit them because everything is on hold right now. So that's a very unfortunate situation, and a lot of people are in a very tough spot right now because of this hold. There's a lawsuit that was filed a couple of weeks ago in Massachusetts, which challenges this hold and seeks to lift the hold so that people's benefit applications are approved again. We don't know. There's a hearing scheduled for April 7th, so we'll have to see what the judge says. And our hope is that the judge orders to lift the hold, because otherwise we'll literally see every day new people are losing their jobs because they don't have employment authorization. Their old card expired, the new card they couldn't receive because of the hold, and people are basically, and also people are falling out of status because their humanitarian parole was only for 2 years. during the Biden administration, you could extend it for 2 more years, but you had to apply for extension close to the expiration of your current parole. So now we have a lot of people in a situation where the prior parole expires soon or expired, and they've applied for the new one, but because everything is on hold, they didn't get the new one, so they are out of status. Yeah, and so they're now, and with all this, Trump's advertising campaign about deportations, people are just scared that, can I fly domestically because there are ICE raids in the airport? And what if they find out that my parole has expired? Will they deport me? The answer is probably,
And
unfortunately.
of course, as they fall out of the system, they're forced to go into like illegal employment, which opens them up
Yeah,
to
yeah.
other forms of legal liability that can jeopardize future status.
Yes, yes.
So it's all so even though this is not the longest gap in time, I suppose, in between one, hopefully all things working out for the best. If it comes together, it may not be the longest gap in time, but 1 month without employment, it's losing rent, can't feed your family, that kind of thing. It's
Yeah. The other problem we have is that during the Biden administration, Ukrainians were given the what's called a temporary protected status. That's basically like parole is a permission to enter the country for 2 years, but it's not as immigration status per se. But they could apply for temporary protected status, which is an immigration status which allows them to legally stay and work in the country. And the status is every 18 months, the government decides whether to extend the status for the country. And normally, if there's war in the country, the status is extended at least until the end of the war, and sometimes longer if there's like places which are completely destroyed and people cannot return there because there's no infrastructure, then it can be extended even after the war. So during the Biden administration, Ukrainians who came at that time would apply for temporary protected status. And so even if their parole expired, they could still stay in the temporary protected status. Now, the latest extension should have been made in February. We were hoping that it would be made in February. Now, in February, Trump already was the president, and he didn't extend it. And so now we have people whose parole expires in the next few months and who are not eligible for temporary protected status because they came later than the last designation. And so starting August, we will have people whose parole expired and who are not eligible for any other status, and they're just basically illegals here. Even though they have nowhere to return, there's still war in their country, and they're basically stuck. They can stay here and they cannot return there. And so that's a big problem. And just conceptually, I think it's extremely unfair, fundamentally unfair, because if you invited these people to the country under this Uniting for Ukraine program, which was a government program specifically for Ukrainians, you have to let them stay at least until the war ends, instead of leaving them out of status, without documents, without an opportunity to, job, get health insurance. Because the only apparent purpose of this policy is to just leave people in such conditions that they'll leave voluntarily because they won't be able to, find a job here or rent a room or get health insurance.
and that pretty much has been what certain members of the administration have been saying, is they want to encourage voluntary
self-deportation.
self-deportation.
But it's one thing when you're talking about, I don't know, Mexican citizens who, yes, there are problems in the country, but you can live in that country. And the other thing is when you're talking about Ukraine, where there's active war going on and it's just unsafe for people to be there. And some people just don't have anywhere to return anymore. And it's just cruel and unfair. But that's what we're dealing with. And as of today, there's no solution to that problem. And we don't know whether they will be, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, well outside the scope of this interview, but there in a lot of European countries right now, we are seeing some falterings of the refugee services systems. In Ireland, there's an issue with the program to house Ukrainian refugees that kind of fell by the wayside. So this is something that's not just in America, but the peculiarities of the American system right now are making it much more extreme than it would be otherwise. But so there is this issue right now of whether this program, the Unite for Ukraine program, will be extended or not. It might not be, but it might be. And it has kind of been hinted in both ways, which is a lot of the things that the Trump administration has been doing with things like tariffs and everything, it's always this weird, what's going to happen kind of black box kind of situation. But are people planning for it to be extended, or are they kind of, hoping for the best and expecting the worst? So how is that kind of?
Of course, everybody's hoping for it to be extended, especially because even though we warned people that as soon as Trump comes, it may be closed. So we warned everybody to fly in as soon as they can. If they want to come to America, use your chance while Biden's in the office. Still, not everybody could. And we have many families where, for example, the husband is in the US, but the wife and the kids are in Ukraine. Or the wife is here with the kids and the husband couldn't get out of Ukraine in time to get to the US. So we have families separated. And there's no way for them, for those family members who are not in the US to come to the US because they don't have a visa and the United for Ukraine is closed. And they're basically stuck in this situation where, the only option really is for those who came here to go back. The closure of United for Ukraine is also a part of this lawsuit that I talked about. It's also being challenged, including on these grounds. And we have been working with the law firm that filed this lawsuit and have given them contacts of these families who have been separated so they can be plaintiffs in this lawsuit to add more compelling cases and examples for the judge to consider reinstating the program. But the reality is that the government has a lot of discretion whether to open or close such programs. And, Biden opened it discretionary, and Trump administration can just as well close it at their discretion, especially because there were legitimate concerns of fraud. Even during the Biden administration, it was discovered. Well, it wasn't so much with Uniting for Ukraine. There were similar parole programs for citizens of Venezuela, Haiti, Cuba, and Nicaragua. And it was discovered that in that program, a lot of because the program requires a sponsor who invites beneficiaries of this country to the United States and pledges that the sponsor will support the beneficiary during the 2-year parole. So in with those countries, it was discovered that a lot of these sponsors were actually like dead people and used somebody else's social security numbers. And there were also serial sponsors who sponsored like hundreds of people. Obviously, you cannot meaningfully support 100 of people. And so that prompted investigation into these parole programs. And I know personally that it affected Ukrainian program in the sense that I know some Ukrainians also had sponsors who were former citizens of Haiti, for example, and they only sponsored Ukrainians because it allowed them to bring their Haitian relatives quicker because Ukrainian program moved quicker. So like some of the United for Ukraine also got kind of mired by that fraud. And that was one of the reasons it was paused in the first place, even during the Biden administration. And now the Trump administration heavily emphasizes that this was the reason the program was closed, because it was fraud-riddled and there was not sufficient vetting of sponsors and beneficiaries. So that's the argument they have in court right now. But even if the program is reinstated, if the judge orders to reinstate it, it is expected that the requirements will be much more stringent than they were during the Biden administration. So during the Biden administration, all you needed to come is to basically have a sponsor who fills out the form and shows sufficient income to support you and your Ukrainian passport, and that's it. So if they reinstate this program now, they will likely require every person to show why they need to come to the United States, where they are now, are they in Ukraine, are they in Europe, are they safe, are they unsafe, like what is their urgent humanitarian reason to be in the United States as opposed to elsewhere. So we don't like even if the program is reinstated, we don't believe it will be the same as it was.
And I'd imagine that the officers in charge of that would be inclined to say no, considering administration guidelines. So I guess our last big question, I have one end question at the end, but this hour went by very quickly. Is there are there efforts by NovaUkraine or others within the Ukrainian American community or within, the pro-Ukraine community in general, of people to lobby for this to be reinstated or some kind of political action to try to get this back on track? And I guess the sub question that is, do you know if that's being worked with alongside other refugee rights programs for people from, say, Venezuela or Mexico, or if it's just Ukrainians trying to do it themselves?
To some extent. The problem is Trump's main issue is with Latin American countries, not with Ukraine. Ukraine is kind of sometimes put in the same bucket with them just because they had the same kind of program. So it's very difficult for the administration to say, the Venezuelan parole program was no good, but Uniting for Ukraine is good, because they're identical programs. So if they challenge one, they challenge the other. There are the human rights organizations and the refugee protection organizations are overwhelmed right now with everything that's going on. They're stretched thin, trying to challenge all these policies. Some of them actually look at Ukraine with a little bit of a disdain because they think Ukraine gets special treatment because it's treated better than Venezuela and Haiti and all those other countries. For example, Trump has already terminated parole for those countries, which means everybody who was given humanitarian parole no longer has it. Just issued an executive order, and the USCIS published a Federal Register rule last week saying that they no longer legal here. Everyone's parole is terminated. Ukrainians' parole has not been terminated yet. They're not getting extensions, but those who have parole now, they still have it, and it's not being terminated. So some of those organizations even think, that Ukraine has a good deal compared to some of the others. That said, yes, there is a
Or at
lot.
least deprioritized.
Yes. That said, there is advocacy. Some of it is some of these policies are challenged for everyone together, like this lawsuit we talked about. It challenges Trump's pause on benefit applications of all parolees, regardless of the country, and also closure of all parole programs, not just Uniting for Ukraine. And there are also some Ukrainian communities who are advocating with Congress to step in and make sure that, what the executive branch is doing is consistent with the law. Congress, unfortunately, doesn't have a lot of power here because immigration is largely at the discretion of executive branch, which means Trump and his agencies. But still, people are trying to advocate with congressmen and even lobby some other maybe new law that would give Ukrainians some new protection status, because temporary protected status is, for a variety of reasons, not adequate. For example, it doesn't protect nationals of other countries who lived in Ukraine. So we had a lot of families where there's like Ukrainian husband and wife who has Moldova passport, right? But they've lived in Ukraine for decades. The husband can get TPS because he's Ukrainian, and the wife cannot. So we have a lot of many of these families, these mixed families, and for them there's no adequate protection status right now. So there's some effort to even enact new law that would help Ukrainians to protect them during the war. But with Republican majority, in Congress, that's also been very challenging. So yes, efforts are made. Trump's orders are challenged in court, but it's a struggle.
Yeah, when you're just trying to stay afloat, it's harder to actually get positive change done alongside it.
Yeah.
And I guess that this last question is one that I like to ask as many of our guests as possible, as long as it's like pertinent to their field. But what our readers, our listeners and viewers want to know very often is what they can do to help, like as an individual person. So this is all, very legal, and not everyone's an immigration lawyer, obviously, but what can just a normal person do within their own communities in order to help Ukrainian refugees, or do something for the refugee community in general? If so, just as an aside, when I was in university, I worked at the local refugee development center, was what it was called, in Lansing, Michigan. And it was how you described. People had 1 year to get a lot of their services. So within that first year, they're entitled to language classes, driving instruction, help with housing. And there it was mostly East Africans, a lot of Somalis, Ethiopians, Kenyans, other people too, but mostly those groups, because that's kind of who was sent to Lansing specifically. But that required a lot of volunteer labor. It didn't know people to do this work, aside from a few lawyers to take care of that kind of thing. So what can an individual person do in their community, like find those development centers or something along those lines?
If we're talking about people in the United States, first of all, you can call your congressman, your senator, your representative, and just educate them that a lot of Ukrainians who are in the United States will lose status soon, and there is no pathway for them to stay even until the end of the war. So encourage your congresspersons to come up with a way to allow Ukrainians to stay here legally, at least until the end of the war, especially since it's the government who invited them. I think the government has certain responsibility to provide them not even like benefits or like support or housing, but just at least a legal status,
Permission. Yeah.
Yeah, and work permission. So that's one thing. Second, NovaUkraine is, accepting donations. Right now, our refugee team is going to, is seeing more people who are losing their housing because of they're losing their jobs. So a lot of people are in a difficult situation. So if you can donate, and you can, when you donate to NovaUkraine, you can put in a comment field that you're donating, for example, to refugee team, and then this money will be allocated specifically to helping people with housing, providing maybe mental health support in this difficult situation, and so on. So that would be direct help to refugees who are struggling right now. And also, if you are if you have free room in your house, which you are willing to, to accept somebody temporary to stay there, if they have nowhere to stay, then you can contact our team, and we will be very grateful. We will add you to our list of hosts, and if we have people in your county, in your city who needs housing, we would connect them with you. And these opportunities are always golden because the housing is very sparse, and a lot of people need it.
Especially in California, what I know
Yeah.
of the housing situation. So we'll put the links of all that in the description, NovaUkraine.org. You can support the refugee program as well as their other programs within Ukraine, including the demining program. And just as an aside there, a lot of the programs for demining in Ukraine were funded by USAID, and that's now gone. So if you want to put in for that as well, Nova Ukraine is one way to do that. Thank you very much for speaking to us right now. I very desperately wanted someone to talk about this, because as soon as it looked like Trump was going to win, that was one thing I figured out, that, oh, he hates refugees, therefore this is going to be a problem for Ukrainian refugees as well. So thank you very much for speaking on that.
Thank you, Anthony. It was a great interview. I'm glad I could talk to more people about it, because these issues need awareness.
Absolutely. And if you would like to contribute to other questions and answer sessions like this in the future, please go to patreon.com/NVUA, where we do these twice a month. I put out the announcement, we collect the questions, we ask questions, we put them online for you, where as well as newsletters, infographics, etc. Lots of premium content, and we're always working to expand that. So thank you all very much for listening. It's rough out there. Do what you can to help the people around you. And Slava Ukraini.